Hi, my name is Chloe Donnelly, and this is my capstone presentation, a conceptual metaphor analysis of the internal family systems model. Consider the following phrases. Part of me wants to call her, but I'm scared. I'm torn. I'm going on a road trip to find myself. I have to get myself together. What happens when parts of you disagree? Do you perceive these inner conversations or arguments as taking place at a fully conscious level? What do you do to resolve them? If you're like me, you might sometimes feel like you're the only person in the world whose mind is made up of disagreeing voices. But as we will talk about today, there is a wealth of research in multiple disciplines to show that the experience of inner plurality is actually ubiquitous, despite having a certain stigma attached to it in older psychological theories. In today's presentation, we will learn about conceptual metaphor theory, which demonstrates just how natural the concept of multiple inner selves really is, in spite of the limited vocabulary we have to describe it. But we will also see how our current conception of those inner selves is not always as empathetic as it could be. We will learn how conceptual metaphor theory may be used to analyze the deep structure of various topics in clinical psychology, and finally, we will look at how a particular psychological theory, the internal family systems model, elaborates our metaphorical model for the self in a way that promotes self compassion. So, what is conceptual metaphor theory? Well, as linguists, we are interested in explaining both language patterns and the thought patterns that inform them. Over the past few decades, George Lakoff has demonstrated how our thought patterns are largely structured by metaphor. In other words, we cannot help but think metaphorically and then act on those understandings. One such example is the metaphor argument is war. We can see it in phrases like, your claims are indefensible, and I've never won an argument with him. The metaphor is realized by the ontological mapping of concepts from the target or abstract domain of argument onto the source or more concrete domain of war. We know metaphor is deeper than the lexical level because we don't only talk about argument in terms of war, we can actually win or lose. Metaphor can even be embodied. We can literally or figuratively feel wounded after a verbal fight. Conceptual metaphor has started to be used in psychological research over the past decade, but integration is slow. This is due to what Lakoff describes as a false rift between the two fields. Essentially, psychotherapists believe they deal with pathology, while cognitive scientists believe they deal with routine workings of the mind. This overly binary view may be traced back to Freud, who actually described many of the same mental mechanisms cognitive scientists do, including conceptual metaphor, which he called symbolization. But Freud perceived these as irrational modes of primary process thinking, while cognitive scientists assert that they are an indispensable part of ordinary rational thought, which is largely unconscious. And modern research has shown how conceptual metaphor can be a useful tool in working with patients anywhere on the mental health spectrum. One example of conceptual metaphor's benefit to clinical psychology is offered by Lakoff himself. Examining a few case studies, Lakoff demonstrates how dreams show evidence of the same general system of metaphorical thought that he and others have shown to govern our everyday waking lives. Take, for example, the metaphor love is a journey. Dream imagery is constrained by metaphors like this at what is called the superordinate level, but the images themselves are realized in examples from the subordinate level. For example, you might dream in images of a car, roads, bridges, bad weather, and so forth, while mentally processing an issue in your relationship. Modern researchers have followed Lakoff's lead, adding to a small but growing body of literature that details conceptual metaphor theory's usefulness as a clinical tool. For example, a 2018 study showed that patients felt heard when therapists picked up on their metaphors. And likewise, therapists reported an improved rapport with patients, suggesting that intentional use of metaphor may even help to change their clients' distorted views. One example of this comes from another study by psychologist Marco Casinato. His work with bulimia patients demonstrates how conceptual metaphor may be a useful touchstone in identifying patients' individual metaphors. He observed that the general metaphors eating is a game and eating is love are, for his bulimic patients, paralleled in bulimia is a game and fasting is love. Conceptual metaphor has also been gainfully used in schizophrenia research, in which it has helped to identify what aspect of semantics accounts for the unusual speech and comprehension deficits in schizophrenia. One 2011 study ultimately theorized that schizophrenic delusions are literal interpretations of conceptual metaphors and their elaborations. For example, having the idea, I am like someone possessed by the devil in the pre delusional period, can become, I am possessed by the devil later on. These researchers and others are part of the growing movement to integrate conceptual metaphor more extensively into a complex framework of social and cognitive dynamics. It is the goal of this paper to contribute to that integration. The conceptual metaphor most relevant to our discussion of the self and inner plurality is the divided person metaphor. This is a superordinate metaphor that forms the basis for a system of overlapping and sometimes contradictory submetaphors by which we conceptualize the self. Consider the counterfactual in the yellow box on the left. It is clear from this example that reflexive pronouns do not always reference the same person. In order to understand these examples, we must conceptualize a person as having two parts. The subject is understood as the locus of subjective experience, consciousness, perception, judgment, and capacity to feel, though the actual emotions are conceived of as separate in the self, which is constituted by the part of us that acts in the world, including our bodies, emotions, cultural frameworks, and more. Though the submetaphors we find in this framework are sometimes contradictory, it is important to note that we consistently view these two elements in a hierarchy. The rational subject is privileged above the self, and often tasked with controlling it. As with all conceptual metaphors, Lakoff writes that it is important to consider whether or to what extent this metaphor is universal versus culturally specific. While not enough research has been done to know for sure, existing studies find that metaphors for the self appear to have significant similarities and overlap, even in very different languages, like Japanese and English. For the sake of our purposes here, we will assume, as Lakoff does, that metaphors present in the English language represent the current Western metaphorical model for the self. Because we cannot help but think metaphorically, conceptual metaphors are found at the basis of every theoretical framework. Bearing this in mind, the internal family systems model can be seen as a particular elaboration of the divided person metaphor. In other words, this model draws on the same conceptual metaphors we already use to understand the self. It just elaborates them in a richer way, one that helps to cultivate self-understanding and empathy. The theory was first developed by psychologist Dr. Richard Schwartz in the 1980s. Schwartz was trained in family systems therapy, an approach that attempts to mitigate patients' symptoms by focusing on improving their external relationships alone. But even after addressing these, some of his patients' symptoms persisted. This was especially true in his work with bulimia patients. One day in session, frustrated, Schwartz stepped outside the clinical approach he had trained in and asked a patient named Quinn about her inner experience and what was occurring there that kept driving her to binge and purge. Quinn responded by describing warring parts in her mind, seemingly autonomous voices that could talk back, say funny things, and were willing to cite their motives. They were essentially a group of quasi-autonomous inner people. After listening to and dialoguing with many of his patients' inner parts, Schwartz found that they tend to take on three general roles: managers, firefighters, and exiles. Managers and firefighters are both protectors, interested in suppressing or hiding the parts of the psyche that feel injured or outraged for the good of the system. These hidden parts are called exiles. Exiles are often young, an inner part with the innocence and temperament of a child, lacking the capacity to process the trauma they have experienced. Managers and firefighters both work to keep exiles out of mind, but they have very different approaches to accomplishing this. Managers are highly protective, strategic, and interested in controlling the environment to keep things safe. Firefighters, by contrast, come forward in emotional emergencies when an exile is in distress to stifle, anesthetize, or distract from their feelings. Firefighter tactics can be extreme and often include numbing activities like self mutilation, binge eating, drug or alcohol abuse, dissociation, and sexual risk taking. They can overtake a person thoroughly without concern for the distress they may cause to other parts of the system. Because of this, the protective parts, managers and firefighters, are often polarized and in conflict. Schwartz found that the dysfunctional relationship dynamics of his patients' inner parts mirrored those he had observed in external families. Subsequently, he approached improving their communication with some of the same strategies. For example, he found that when he attempted to speak to one of his patient's inner parts, another part would often interrupt. As he would with external people, Schwartz developed a strategy of asking those interrupting parts to step back. Eventually, Schwartz discovered that if he asked enough of a patient's parts to step back, he would eventually reach one that was only open and curious. This open and curious part proved to be the natural leader of the others, calm, confident, and compassionate. Schwartz had initially feared that he would have to teach one of his patient's inner parts the necessary leadership skills to guide the others, necessitating too many therapy sessions to be realistically feasible or helpful for patients. But what he discovered instead was that all his patients already had this inner part, the natural leader. This finding was groundbreaking and cemented the status of the internal family systems model as a non-pathologizing one. And we can clearly see that this compassion in IFS is present in the way it elaborates the divided person metaphor. For example, in our current model, we consider normal functioning to be a state in which we suffer no internal incompatibilities. Through the IFS elaboration, we see that internal incompatibilities are actually normal and ubiquitous, evidence of the psyche protecting itself. It is true that optimal functioning is an experience of the inner parts in harmony, but this state is considered to be in flux, with communication among the inner parts a permanent necessity. And while the language we have to talk about inner parts is fairly limited, as exemplified by reflexive pronouns, the IFS perception of inner parts as people allows us to conceive of a variety of personalities and interactions among them. Within this, we find space to reimagine our everyday conceptions of ourselves and find healing. Another element of our current conceptual model that IFS elaborates more compassionately is the binary in our conception of rationality and emotions. To review, the subject is considered the locus of rationality, while emotions are seen to reside separately in the self. In current Western culture, we consider that the subject should be in control of the self, because otherwise our desires may lead us to cause harm. In the IFS elaboration, we are able to see that while the true self is the natural leader of the other parts, its job is not to control them as much as it is to listen to, guide, and work with them. Internal family systems also helps us remove the hierarchy of our inner selves. The IFS elaboration of the objective subject metaphor is one such example. This metaphor can be seen in expressions like, he had to take a good hard look at himself, and you need to step outside yourself. Through this sub-metaphor, we conceive of the self as a container for the subject, and we understand that being subjective is staying inside the self, while being objective is going outside. This mapping combines with the metaphor knowing is seeing, and we understand that when one is inside the container, one cannot see outside of it. One is normally inside, so going outside takes more effort and more control. In the IFS elaboration, various inner parts are asked to step aside, almost like removing layers, and at some point uncovering the true self, or open and curious part. The uncovering of a central self draws on the same metaphor as removing the subject from the container. The two conceptual models share elements of effort, control, and removing a more central part from a state of being encased. In the IFS elaboration, though, each removed element is seen as an important aspect of the self as a whole system, which removes the hierarchical conception of objectivity and subjectivity. Another important reframing offered by the IFS elaboration is in the concept of the split self. In our current conceptual model, we conceive of internal incompatibilities through two common metaphors: being at war with oneself and going back and forth, as in, I can't decide what to do, I keep going back and forth on it. From the mappings of these metaphors, we understand that having the same values is being in the same place, and indecision is going back and forth. What we ultimately infer from this is that since you can't be in two places at the same time, you can't have incompatible values, and adopting new values necessarily entails giving up old ones. In this metaphor, we can again see evidence of the limited binary thinking of our current conceptual model. But the IFS elaboration normalizes internal incompatibilities or inconsistent values. In IFS, the true self or open and curious part listens to the arguments of different protectors and sympathizes or is in the same place as each of them in different moments. Again, here the emphasis shifts to acceptance of and working within the whole. IFS acknowledges that there will always be different self aspects or internal roles with their individual perspectives and goals. The objective of therapy and self inquiry in general is about finding a way for the system to be in harmony. We can also observe the shift from hierarchy to systems approach in the IFS elaboration of the submetaphor self control is up. Because control is up and lack of control is down, our current metaphorical model conceives of the subject as being above the self and exerting control over it, as in, he's got control over himself. Losing control, then, is seen as the subject falling or being overcome. Since reason is seen as localized to the subject and passion is localized to the self, we understand that reason is up and passion is down. This metaphor may be observed in expressions like, the argument fell to an emotional level, a sudden impulse came over me, and we had a high level rational discussion. The negative connotations of falling into or being overcome by emotions are further strengthened by their association with another conceptual metaphor: health is up, sickness is down. The emotional mind is perceived as something we must be wary of succumbing to, almost like an illness. This is a key variable that the IFS elaboration reframes, in which no such hierarchy exists. The spatial conception does not deal in components of above and below. More vulnerable parts of the system are simply seen as behind the others. The concept of being overcome by an emotion or impulse is recognized in IFS as a protector coming forward or coming out, often a firefighter if the change is sudden and dramatic. But even in these cases, where a protector causes us to engage in an extreme numbing activity, the IFS model cultivates compassion. We understand that protectors have a valid reason for coming forward. They are doing so for the protection of the exiles and the survival of the system. When we seek to understand the impetus for these responses with openness and curiosity, we can actually view them as helpful clues to system understanding and repair. In conclusion, in comparing our current metaphorical conception of the self with the internal family systems model, we have seen how different metaphorical elaborations come with different inferences. The divided person metaphor demonstrates that though we are conscious of the plural psyche in our current conceptual model, the various selves are conceived of in a hierarchical manner, one that overemphasizes a rational perspective and devalues emotion. Internal family systems frames the self with the same set of metaphors we already use, but it elaborates the model more fully, personifying the inner parts and providing us with language for the various roles they can take and the rich variety of interactions that occur between them. This elaborated model allows us to consider the needs of each of our inner parts as valid and crucial to our mental well-being. Our discussion today also demonstrates the necessity of analyzing the metaphorical structure of theoretical frameworks in general. Applying conceptual metaphor as an analytical lens reveals the ideas implicit within these frameworks, assumptions that ultimately inform decisions made by researchers, the media, and even policymakers. In this way, understanding the conceptual models by which we live can create real change in people's lives. And elucidating the different elaborations of conceptual metaphors will only provide more insight into the workings of the mind, inspiring further research in the field of metaphor itself. For these reasons, it is crucial that the knowledge of conceptual metaphor is integrated with that of other fields. As Lakoff said in his 1997 paper, people can believe their metaphors and live according to them. I think the onus is on us now as cognitive linguists to investigate the frameworks of other disciplines and uncover the beliefs upon which they are operating. Thank you for listening.